I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Dean Detloff, and I am your acrostic youth group poem.
Oh, that's cool.
JESUS. What could those letters possibly mean?
And I'm Matt Bernico. I'm working the front desk at the Creation Museum.
That's great. I was going to hold off on this, but since you mentioned it, I do just want to flag that I have a Creation Museum a Creation Museum themed activity for us later in a minute.
That's great. I love activities.
I've got a good one. I went on vacation, and now my brain can only think of activities. So that's what you're going to get on this podcast from now on.
Yeah, we got coloring pages. We got crossword puzzles. That's it. Those are the only activities that you can do.
No, don't worry. We're proliferating more. Before we get there, we decided that we should probably remind people that you should take the time, if you haven't already, to rate our podcast on Apple Podcasts in particular, but elsewhere if you have access to it, because people find our podcast if it gets reviewed. And the more it gets reviewed more frequently, the more people can find it. And we used to say this all the time, and then we stopped saying it for no good reason or by no intention. But I think we're going to bring back the reading reviews on the podcast down the line. So if you've never given us a 5-star review, or if you want to give us some more, you can invent some fake identities and do it yourself.
There was actually a recent review. I'm not going to read it, but someone said they appreciated how real we were. And it's true. We are real.
We're real people. Not a program. All right. Well, speaking of real people, Matt, like I said, I've been on vacation out in the real world, away from the internet, unplugged, just back to nature at Universal Studios Orlando, Florida in particular. I did go there with my very loving and kind partner Emily and a bunch of my friends, and I did all the rides, and I couldn't stop thinking about how fun it was and how fun all these rides were. And I thought, if only there was a place where I could do this as a Christian. Right. If only there was a place where I could really get in touch with my Lord and Savior while I'm listening to Jimmy Fallon race through New York City. And I didn't find that exactly, but I found the next best thing, which is the Creation Museum, of course. And it just inspired a game that I want to introduce to you, Matt. And I feel like there could probably only be one edition of this game, but who knows? We'll see. I'm going to try to mine it as long as I can, but I think the first one, I've spent a pretty good deal of my afternoon on it, more than I should have, and I'm really pleased to show it to you today.
That sounds good. I'm excited to play this game. I love activities, like I've already said. Have you ever been to the Creation Museum?
I've never been. I want to go, but after doing some research, I've learned that there are even more activities being planned at the Creation Museum in a few years, so I'm going to hold off.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've never been there either.
Have you been there?
No, never.
Oh, okay.
I have some friends who've been, and I'm living vicariously through them. I know that they have a big Noah's Ark down there, too. It sounds great.
That's the main event.
It sounds like a great time. The bad part is that you probably have to pay a lot to them, and I don't feel good about that. But
yeah, I mean, you could pray your way in, I think.
Okay, I could do that.
If you stood outside of that place and you prayed loudly for enough people to hear, and you said, you asked Jesus in front of everybody to let you into that
They'd
place.
have to, right?
They would have to. Yeah, they would have to.
If they didn't, you could march around 7 times, blow a trumpet, and it would all fall apart.
That's right. All right, well, let me introduce you to this game. I hope that you don't know too much about it, having gone vicariously through it with your friends, but I suppose we'll find out. The name of the game is Answers in Genesis.
Okay.
And as you probably know, the Creation Museum is funded by Answers in Genesis, a Christian institution dedicated to spreading creationism and combating the evils of evolution. And the way this game works is there are a number of attractions at the Creation Museum. Everybody knows about that big ark, and that's why everybody goes. But there are lots of, let's say, B-level attractions. And so what I've done here is there are 3 descriptions of attractions you might find at the Creation Museum. 2 of them are real. Mm-hmm. And I've taken the copy directly from the website, and one of them is fake. And I've written it myself using a mixture of my own stupid brain and some other text I found at Answers in Genesis. And it's up to you, Matt, to find out which one is the fake.
This is going to be so hard.
Are you ready to play Answers in Genesis?
Yeah, I really am.
All right, here it goes. The first attraction I have for you is called simply Dragon Legends, and it goes a little something like this. Once upon a time, a young, beautiful princess was trapped in a castle tower. Suddenly, she was in grave danger when a fire-breathing dragon flew toward her tower window, but a knight in shining armor came to her rescue, narrowly avoiding a fiery death as he slayed the dragon just as it swooped down. Everyone is familiar with these classic dragon stories, but is there any truth to the supposed fairy tales and legends like Beowulf, Chinese dragons, or Nessie? Before the word dinosaur, which refers only to land-dwelling creatures, was invented in the 1800s, the word dragon was used. Exhibits at the Creation Museum explain how that means all dinosaurs are dragons, but not all dragons are dinosaurs. Dragons are depicted both today and in ancient times in artwork, cave paintings, carvings, and architecture, look an awful lot like dinosaurs, or marine reptiles or pterosaurs. Could it be that the artists behind these depictions were drawing a real-life animal they'd seen with their own eyes? Encounter dragon legends from history and across the globe at the Creation Museum. Consult the scriptures and decide for yourself whether dragons are myth, fairy tale, legend, or truth. There you have it. That's the first one.
Okay, that's very upsetting.
How are you feeling so far?
So far, I'm upset. I'm mad. I'm angry.
Mm-hmm.
I want to see this so bad, though.
Good. That's the headspace I want you to be in. All right, here is number 2. So we've got Dragon Legends on the board. Number 2 is called Battle Over the Nephilim. And here it goes. Seemingly out of nowhere, the expression giants on the earth crops up in Genesis 6:4. Who were these giants? Where did they come from? Interpreters have debated their identity for nearly 2,000 years. A quick reading might lead you to interpret the passage one way, but a closer look reveals many other possibilities, which need to be considered if you want to make sure your interpretation is consistent with the rest of Scripture. We can't just accept our first impression or what one commentator says, but we need to prayerfully examine all the biblical evidence for ourselves. Christians will likely continue to disagree on this topic until the Lord returns, so we need to show grace to other believers agreeing to disagree. In the battle over the Nephilim, visitors will be presented with evidence for the 3 most popular views so you can make up your mind for yourself. Are the Nephilim the descendants of the lineage of Seth, powerful and mighty rulers in the ancient world? Could they be a group of severely fallen and brutal people? Or could they even be fallen angels who married human women and produced a race of giants, the last straw before God flooded the earth? The exhibit will guide you through the biblical text with maps, archaeology, artist depictions, and even scale models that bring the Bible to life. At the Creation Museum, you can weigh the evidence yourself and learn how to respect the beliefs of other Christians on this tricky topic.
The respect other people's beliefs part is really throwing me here. That makes me feel like it's definitely not the right one.
But see, it's other Christian beliefs is the key.
Okay, that's a good point. It's not just anyone's beliefs; it's just Christians' beliefs. You can respect.
There's
other
a lot
Christian
of room
beliefs.
for interpretation here.
Yeah, you can respect other Christian beliefs as long as it's only about the Nephilim.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. All right, and I'm going to give you the third one, and I'm going to have you weigh them all at the end. The third one is called Dr. Crawley's Insectorium, and it goes something like this. In our world-class collection of insects from around the world, you will be transferred into a world of staggering beauty, stunning acrobatic feats, ceaseless variety, and spectacular weirdness. In Dr. Crawley's Insectorium, you'll learn interesting facts. For example, did you know that not all insects are bugs, but all bugs are insects? The exhibit features Dr. Arthur Pod, a fictional animatronic person who answers visitors' questions about these incredibly designed insects. Do you want to learn about the purpose of insects, the explosive bombardier beetle, or whether there's a reason for the beauty of butterflies? Let the doctor know, and he'll teach you about your topic of choice. Dr. Jeff Crawley is a real creation scientist who generously donated his insect collection to the Creation Museum in 2013. The collection represents a lifetime of collecting by Dr. Crawley, who began his interest in these creatures during a merit badge project as a kid. Wherever his travels took him, he would venture out and add to his collection. The goal of every collector, Dr. Crawley says, should be to share his collection with others. All right, Matt, so you've got Dragon Legends, Battle Over the Nephilim, and Dr. Crawley's Insectorium. Which one is false?
So first of all, let me say that you've done a really good job sort of crafting a red herring in here, because they all sound pretty plausible to be in the Creation Museum. But
Great, I'm really glad to hear that.
You have made one fatal mistake that I think gives it away.
Oh no.
So the false one, the false gospel about the Creation Museum is the second one about the Nephilim, because there's no way in hell that Kenneth Ham is gonna teach kids about the Book of Enoch. That's just not gonna happen. It's not even possible that he would do that, right? Like, that must be the fake one.
All right, here's the thing. It is the fake one. You are right. However, the wildest part about it is almost all the copy on this thing that I took is directly taken from the Answers in Genesis website, barring just a few things to suggest that you could visit such an exhibit.
Yeah. It's too bad, though. It'd be a badass exhibit.
I do want to see those big fallen angels.
I want those giants. I gotta see them.
Here's two crazy things about the real ones, however. First of all is the repetition of rhetoric, namely, in Dragon Legends, you learn that not all dinosaurs are dragons, all dinosaurs are dragons, but not all dragons are dinosaurs.
Yeah,
and you learn a similar fact in Dr. Crawley's Insectorium, that not all insects are bugs, but all bugs are insects.
The curators at the Creation Museum, they took one logic class in college, and they learned about necessity and insufficiency, and this is it. They've done it. Now they're really cashing in on that college education from Liberty University.
That's right. Yeah, listen, you know that thing about squares and triangles? All right, think about that, but dragons and dinosaurs.
Bugs and insects. All right. That was great. That was a fantastic game. I've been amused. I don't know. We shouldn't have answered it. We should have let everyone write in to say what they thought it was. Shit.
That's true. It's such an easy Google, though.
Good point. We would have had a lot of cheaters. That's okay.
Yeah, so the other wild thing about this is there is a real-life exhibit with an animatronic Dr. Arthur Pod who does answer your questions about these incredibly designed insects.
Dr. Arthur Pod is very funny.
Dr. Arthur Pod, the horrible Answers in Genesis robot, is very funny.
Yeah. I don't want to go. I don't want to go see the magic bugs.
I mean, I do. I really want to go. There are so many things on the horizon. Okay, I have to ask you not to look at it again, because perhaps I might, if there's enough material, I may bring the segment back in the future for coming attractions, because there are some in the works. But I need to, really do my due diligence to come up with a good red herring.
Okay, so you're asking me to not look at the Creation Museum website.
That's right. I know it's very difficult, but I am asking you to do that.
It's my homepage. I have to go change it right
now. So there you have it. Answers in Genesis. You've won. You're 1 for 1.
I need to get a trophy for myself.
Yep. Ken Ham would be proud. All right. This podcast, despite what you may think so far, is not about these bad games or these bad museums. In fact, it's, as we said at the beginning, about Christianity and leftist politics. And specifically, we've been talking about poetry for the last several episodes. As you can see, I'm still on vacation brain. I can't even string words together in a coherent sentence yet. But we're going to do it by the end of this episode. We'll sound like the intelligent, helpful people that we normally are. So to give you a little roundup of where we've been, and also to give myself a little roundup, we decided to do some episodes on poetry, an arc on poetry. This year is the year of poetry. And to do that, we began talking about Ernesto Cardenal, a Nicaraguan poet and revolutionary Catholic priest. Really important guy in the Sandinista revolution and the government, who wrote all kinds of interesting poetry and even came up with a school of thought about poetry called exteriorismo. Very neat stuff. And then we talked to some real life poets who are writing poems today. Tegan Steele Fisher and Dominic Knowles, who both also graciously read some poems for us in the episode. Really great stuff. 2 episodes, one for each of them. You should go back and listen to them. But as we were thinking about how to cap this off, we decided to follow a lead that Tegan gave to us when they mentioned being into Dorothee Sölle, who appears in Tegan's book. And so we thought we would go back to a Sölle book that we've actually mentioned on this podcast in the past when we did an anti-war episode not too long ago. The book is called Of War and Love. It's kind of like a hodgepodge of writing, I guess, like letters and sermons and essays and poetry, and we decided to focus on the poems in particular. So hopefully this is a good way to round out some of the stuff that we've learned and talk through some actual work by a Christian leftist poet. Matt, anything you want to say up front maybe about the book or anything that really stood out to you in it?
Yeah, for sure. It is my favorite type of book in that it is lacking a lot of organization. You can be reading an essay and then the next page without any sort of like break or explanation. There's just a poem, and that's really cool. I like that. It's also good because all the essays are relatively short. So if you're like me and you're living on dad time, which means you have about 15-minute increments before you need to like stop your child from destroying your house. It's a great book to read because you just pick it up, you put it down, doesn't even matter. So it's great. You should go check it out. It's definitely worth, acquiring and reading.
Yeah, I agree. It's a really nice book because it does have that like brevity to it. But it's also like Sölle has such a great writing style in her poetry, but also in her prose. And it just reads along really quickly, nicely. Lots of good turns of phrase that you can tweet out and think about for a long time. And those are the kind of books you want, the books that build your brand.
Yeah, so the book has 2 big parts to it. The first part focuses on themes of rebellion and organizing resistance against militarism. Militarism was Dorothee Sölle's kind of big thing, at least in the very beginning of this book. A lot of her work in this book is responding to NATO and the proliferation of arms during the Cold War. So that's kind of the backdrop of it. And then the second section, though, focuses more on Latin America and then a lot of the same themes about rebellion and resistance and that kind of thing, but in Latin American context rather than European. I don't know. Is that good, Dean?
Yeah, I think so. I guess we could say a little bit more, too, about Dorothee Sölle. She's a German theologian. She's really into activism, but in a decidedly leftist horizon. But she's also a fascinating theologian because she worked on kind of like the trauma of fascism in Germany and what it meant for Christians to participate in fascism and what that meant for her own faith. So she really investigated that. But she was also a participant in anti-imperialist forms of socialism and the New Left at the time in particular. She was a member of Christians for Socialism, both in Germany and in the U.S. She taught at a Union Theological Seminary for a while in New York. She was really into like the Chilean solidarity movement, especially. She was a huge supporter of the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. Anyway, she has like a very clear alignment with the left. She like visited Vietnam after the war was over and was really impressed by the communist project there, and she held people like Ho Chi Minh in really high regard. So anyway, she's definitely a theologian of the left, and in that sense too, it's neat to be able to read her poems that draw all those themes out, like the other folks we've been reading. Oh dang, I totally forgot to mention earlier the one person that it's fitting in some ways that I forgot to mention in this poetry rec was Joe Wallace, the Canadian poet that everyone has forgotten.
When I was listening back to some of the episodes, and in every episode I basically have to re-explain who Joe Wallace is, and every time it's like, I don't know, man, he's just like this weird guy. I don't know what to tell you about him.
That's right. It came to mind because I was thinking about what I love about Dorothee Sölle's poems is that they're actually pretty simple. And they're profound, but you can really read them and get them. And for some reason that brought Joe Wallace to mind, I guess, with his goofy rhyme schemes. Anyway, we should, it's enough by way of introduction. We should just dive into some of these poems here. So there are lots of poems in the book, but we've curated a few of our favorites. We'll read some of the more, I don't know, like things of topical interest later, but I thought to start, Matt, we could talk through this figure that she kind of invents and uses throughout the book, a figure of the ogre, this kind of poetic image, this big horrible Shrek that she invents that stands in for militarism, and the ogre shows up in several different poems. We won't read all of them, but we'll read a few of them. And I think maybe the best way to get into it would actually just to be able to hear the first poem where the ogre shows up, and then we can kind of talk through it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. The first poem that Zuela writes with the ogre is at the very beginning of her book, and it's called In the House of the Man-Eating Ogre. Born in the era of gas, I find myself in the house of the ogre. His wife, comely and plump, took me in, looked after me, gave me plenty to eat, and hid me from him when he came home. Life isn't so bad in the house of the ogre. During the day, he goes about the land, stationing missiles, ruining highways, and training young men for deployment at home or abroad. For the distant enemy, the ogre displays his famous first strike. To those in his own land who still talk back, even after heavy doses of radiation, he has dogs and gas, of course. I myself am free to come and go as I please during the day, in the house of the ogre. I joke with his wife and don't fret about anything. Only in the evening he comes home and sniffs around and looks for me. Do I tremble in fear in my little bomb-proof box? Then I dream about the dismembered bodies, about starving yellowish children. Then I hate my father and mother for bringing me into this world, at this time, in this country. Someday, it's never been any different. The ogre will eat us. That's the way it's always been up to now.
Yikes. What a big one.
Yikes is right. So this is the first the first time we see the ogre showing up in her work, at least as far as this book goes. But the ogre is a character that's going to come back again and again. And I mean, it's not. It is a simple poem, a simple metaphor. You kind of get the idea, though, right? Like the ogre is militarism. It's imperialism. It's the thing that oppresses people around the world through force. You live in a country where it happens, and you think that you're free to go about your day. You can come and go as you please. You have a good time, even maybe you like it. It's comfortable, but at the same time, at the end of the day, you can't help but thinking that the whole reason that you're able to live here in any kind of comfort is because it's like oppressing and killing people other places in the world. So that's the ogre.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really neat poem because there's so many unsettling feelings in it, I think. I mean, there's the ethical complicity, like you mentioned, of being feeling safe in a place that is maintained by violence. But it's almost like she's sort of held captive in that place, like free to come and go as she pleases, except when the ogre comes home, then it's bad news, and the ogre will eventually eat everybody in the home anyway. I think that is really interesting. This is kind of like horror that pervades the whole poem. So it's imperialism abroad for sure, but also if you get a little too upset inside the house or you make a noise or something, then the ogre will find you. So there's a policing that happens within the house as well. I think that's a really neat metaphor.
Yeah. Well, we're not going to talk about them, I think, any more than this maybe. In some of the other essays kind of early on and sermons early on, she talks a lot about the sort of trap of security that comes alongside, like militarism abroad. basically the idea is militarism abroad, increases the, security of the country's borders or something like that. And that security is supposed to make us all feel better, but in fact, it doesn't. It makes us more paranoid and so on. But you see that kind of here too, right? The ogre is doing this thing out in the world, but then it comes back and still inflicts its presence and violence upon the people of the country. So I don't know. That's just like a theme that kind of reoccurs throughout her work.
Yeah, it's neat that you mentioned too that there's all kinds of themes that come up in the prose around this poem. I think that is helpful to me because one thing that we asked Tegan and Dominic both was, what's important about a poem, or what can you do with a poem that you can't do in an essay, or, what's specific to it. And they had some really great answers. What I appreciate about this book is that you can kind of see that demonstrated or performed, because the poems are often saying the same thing that's being said in a sermon or in an essay, but the image that gets conjured up is a very different kind of image than her just saying something like, look, imperialism is bad, there's something a little more, it like sits with you or makes you feel it a bit differently.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, just personifying, militarism into the ogre and making it, the type of character that it does sit with you in a different way. It puts a face to something that is faceless, and that's really kind of helpful when you're thinking about it.
Yeah, well, I want to talk more about this ogre, so I'll read the next one that we have here, because it's also a great segue, because the title is simply, "And What Does the Ogre Look Like?" So we've got the ogre who lives in this house and goes around pointing bombs everywhere and is eventually going to eat anybody inside. But I love that the next poem really kind of contextualizes how this all looks. So she says this. In a photograph taken at the Rheinmetall factory, I count 5 animate beings and 7 artillery shells. The animate beings are dressed in suits, white shirts, and ties, which leads me to think that they are men. Their hair ranges from thick to thinning to sparse, which leads me to think that they are in their mid-30s to mid-50s. All but one are exposing their upper front teeth, which leads me to think that they have just made a profitable deal. All of them hold on to the weapons they have produced, with one hand or both self-confidently proud or buddy-like, which leads me to think that they love weapons. Their self-confidently proud or buddy-like stances lead me to think, in addition, that they would like to have colossal pricks. All the representatives of the weapons firm shown here, with the exception of the unsmiling one whose half-open mouth gives him an idiotic look, strike me as dynamically precise and decisive, which leads me to think that they will determine my German fate, as has happened twice before in this country, unless we strip them of power. I like that one a lot. It's a very good poem.
Yeah, for sure.
For a lot of reasons. But again, just like a really kind of photographic image that is literally based on her looking at a photograph.
That's true. She's just describing something that she sees, but describing something that she sees within the context of the ogre, and it kind of, it's fun because it adds a level of banality to what the ogre is, right? It's not like, when it comes to like evil and really terrible things in the world, you expect them to be dramatic and scary, but in the case of militarism and imperialism, it really is just like she's describing it, right? It's a bunch of like doofy looking white guys selling bombs to one another.
Yeah, exactly. Here's a great thing. So Rheinmetall, I had to look it up because I don't know what that is. It's a German word. I'm probably pronouncing it very badly, but they're as you might have guessed, a defense contractor. But my first Google hit for it says Rheinmetall AG, Rheinmetall Group, Integrated Technology Group. It says it's an environmentally friendly mobility threat appropriate security technology.
Holy shit.
And the idea that it's environmentally friendly is so horrifying, and really kind of brings home, I think, what Zoela is after here.
Yeah, like completely stupid, well-meaning, but at the same time, like actually awful.
Yeah, right. And it's like environmentally friendly unless you happen to be a human being in an environment that imperialism doesn't like.
Yeah, totally. It's completely stupid.
So that's what the ogre looks like.
That's what the ogre looks like. Okay, so the ogre shows up again later in the book in another poem called "And on the Other Side of the Border." And on the other side of the border, you realize that, don't you? Lives an ogre who is much worse. Totally undemocratic. He's growing fat on the possessions and taxes, on the bodies and time and life, on the spirit and soul and research of the poor who are his subjects. Unrestrained by a free democratic social order, he must never forget that he is growing unchecked, and according to our latest information, his waist is 1 inch larger than that of our ogre, though his live weight is 1/4 pound less, and that right on our border. So that we have no choice but to take appropriate measures, and to end the emaciation of our native ogre. We have no choice but to catch up by building him up. The ogre here is recognizing that there's not just one ogre, but there's many. There's at least 2, right? This is like
Right.
this is, recognizing that there are other powers in the world that might also be ogres. And that in light of those ogres, you have to just make yours bigger and feed it more things that ogres eat, which, according to Shrek, I think is onions, but I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah, definitely not parfaits. Yeah, I mean, it's a great poem, I think, because also in the prose that surrounds it, she talks more about the proliferation of arms, and she makes a couple of comments throughout the book about how she tells a story about how security is premised on this threat or this fear, but that fear is often not even real. And one example she gives is NATO's push for militarizing Europe. And she says, she's critical of the Soviet Union's participation in the arms buildup as well, although she seems pretty sympathetic to why they feel the need to do it. And there's a moment where she says, by certain estimations, the Soviet Union was basically always about 5 years behind in terms of military technologies. But it didn't really matter. That's not very good messaging if you want to get the populace on your side.
Yeah.
So there was always this kind of image of the Soviet Union as, we have to keep up the arms race so that we can beat them. And the idea here that you always have to remember that there's an ogre on the other side who's even worse than ours. Like, our ogre might be bad, but at least we have democracy.
Yeah.
And it would be worse if their ogre defeated ours. I think that's a really kind of neat way of dramatizing what's at stake in the Cold War.
Yeah. The words, ours is restrained by democracy is a really
right.
I don't know, a really funny thing. It's so restrained by democracy, but we can't help it from getting bigger. Okay.
Right. Yeah, it's cool too to see that to get this poem after reading the very first poem, she kind of gives it away right in the beginning that even if you live in the democratic house of the ogre is still prowling around and eventually is definitely going to eat.
Yeah.
So here you have the voice of ideology later, but it's you're already prepared to see that it's ideological, which I think is a neat device.
Yeah, definitely. The ogre's bad, huh?
Surprise. Well, later in the book, there's a bunch more ogre poems, but I want to read just one last one. I mean, people probably get the idea, but this is my favorite one dealing with the ogre because it's I don't know, not as direct, I guess. Maybe that's it. But I'll read it quick and we can just chat about how these poems kind of work together. So the title of this one is called I Travel Around to Speak About God. I travel around to speak about God and begin, as a matter of course, with the ogre, and ask my listeners not to serve him any longer, not to go on sacrificing their labor and their children to him, their short lives. Softly I speak the language of remembrance, of a life without fear of being eaten alive, and touch once more with my hands the great old words. I speak of the women in the Soviet Union as sisters, and when the hungry are fed I say peace, and I don't apologize for having nothing to say about the ogres in other lands, because after all I was invited to speak about God. I love this poem so much because I just feel that it resonates with my own life experience as a person who's a Christian and a communist. The first thing that anybody always asks you is, what about the bad stuff that happens in communist countries? And the thing that you want to talk about, obviously, is something that should presuppose that you don't like bad things that happen.
Mm-hmm.
It's always trying to sort of hold you back from really getting to the meat of a question, which is, what should we do about our own ogres or something like that? What should we say about God, which isn't necessarily making sure that God is on the side of your nation or something.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, something in the poem just really speaks to my own kind of experience.
It's an interesting way to kind of combat what was happening in the last one, right? On the other side of the border, is, you know, you're so preoccupied with the other ogre that you know, end up justifying making yours bigger or whatever. But here she's saying, I don't know, I don't even talk about that one.
Right. Yeah, it's good. It's good, and it's also good communist praxis too, right? That you shouldn't always go around making the case against yourself before other people do. You know, there's a time and a place to be very critical, and it's important for communists to cultivate a critical consciousness about their own position for sure. But it's also important not to feel like you're always on the defense when what you're actually trying to do is build a different kind of society.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and in those kind of conversations too, you know, people, liberals and conservatives alike, you know, they want you to, you know, apologize for all the bad things that communists have ever done, but they would never do the same for themselves, right? They never do the same for capitalists. So I don't know.
Yeah, they're busy serving their own ogre.
Right, exactly. So anyways, I think there's like an invitation here to think about the world in a little bit of a different way, less adversarially, and less in terms of security and strength, and more in terms of, I don't know, camaraderie or something. but getting away from thinking about the ogres, I guess it's an interesting way to think about militarism. That's for sure. It's definitely something that would be really hard to write about if you were just writing like an expository essay or something. But in the format of poetry, it works, and it is interesting, and it kind of sticks with you.
Yeah, I think so too. And it also testifies to this kind of weird myth-making power that poetry has, or in Zoela's case, almost revealing the Cold War as this myth-making power. So using the image of the ogre is so fascinating because it's this, you know, big, yucky monster. And she has all this prose around it explaining imperialism is bad and the arms proliferation is bad, and you can read all the reasons why it's bad. But here you kind of get hit with this image of this really scary monster who's sort of consuming everything. And I think there's something about that just drives the point home more. And like I said, also reveals the mythical nature of the Cold War, that it's not just a race of technology, of weapons technology, but it's also this attempt to like build a world in which you feel that there are monsters on the other side of the border or something.
Yeah, that's good. Well, we have time for maybe just like 2 more poems, and then okay, cool. All right. Well, here's a poem that Zoela wrote that's not about ogres. I mean, it is in a sort of different way, but but here to go. Okay, this one hit a little close. Just to use some church speak, it hit close to home. You know.
That's right. It really convicted your heart.
That's right. It did convict my heart. Yeah, this one's called Public Relations. And in a former life, when I taught classes on public relations, I thought this one was really good. Okay, so public relations. For the year 1980, the Pentagon earmarked $28 million for public relations. Given the magnitude of the task, that is a minuscule sum. 200 million people live in the United States. Each one of them must be kept from thinking. Each one of them must learn not to use his or her eyes and to suppress the old instincts. Giving a glass of water to someone dying of thirst, giving a parcel of land to someone starving to death, still comes natural to many. Even the need to use one's intelligence is hard to eradicate. Given the magnitude of the task, $28 million for brainwashing is amazingly little. I love that. I love that one so much. Because, well, okay, I mean, public relations is, put nicely, an industry that's supposed to adjust the public's interest to your interests. But put negatively, it is propaganda.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, but this is really funny because it's, you know, what she's saying is that, you know, people are smart. They're gonna still... it's hard to suppress the impulses, you know, to not to tend to the people who really need tending to, but at the same time, the Pentagon is able to do it for an amazingly little amount of money, and I think that's very sad and funny and biting all at the same time. I love it because again, it's like it's expressing something that is extremely critical and a pretty good analysis of the way that a lot of public relations and media and how they work. But it's doing it in, like 15 lines or something rather than a 20-page essay or even like a 2-page essay. This is exactly the kind of thing that we need to be reading when Raytheon is sponsoring the Girl Scouts or whatever. It's a good note.
Yeah, surely the budget has increased.
Yeah, totally.
By 2020. Yeah, I think what's really fascinating though is, like, you're right. It's so the troubling side of the poem is that even with that amazingly little amount of money, the Pentagon does shape an entire population to support doing very bad things. But there's a kind of weird revolutionary optimism in here too that she says, people still kind of naturally react by if you met like a thirsty person, you would give them a glass of water probably, or if someone just broke it down in kind of simple terms, like you would help somebody out just off your kind of base instinct, which might be too optimistic in some respects, but it's neat. I think that she also says the amount of money is amazingly little to think that you could just sort of erase this instinctual desire to help your neighbor with $28 million, which is like less than $1 per person in the U.S.
Yeah, maybe that's one way of reading it, I suppose. I guess I was thinking about it more in terms of like, I don't know, were you faced with someone who is thirsty, you'd totally do this, but that they're kept at a distance through a manufactured, mediated reality, you don't do those things.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, well, poetry
really makes you think.
What can you say? It really makes you think. That's poetry. Well, I've got one more that's poetry poem for you. A pretty good one. This is my favorite one in the whole book. It is called, the title is really great. It's called When I Was Asked for the 502nd Time What I Thought About Violence. Again, just very relatable. So here is what she says. My pacifist friends proceeded with extreme violence at an innocent General Electric plant located in a peace-loving town named King of Prussia when they used an instrument of violence, the old-fashioned hammer, to render some harmless instruments of security, namely atomic missiles, useless. To justify their irresponsible action, they quoted a man from the 8th century BC whose followers they appeared to be, and who was apparently possessed by the crazy idea of beating swords into plowshares on behalf of a higher being. And in the interest of lower beings, people too lazy to work in fringe groups, this violent coalition of the very high and the very low, of what they call God and what they call the poor, represents for us in the neutral middle a genuine threat to security. I love this because it poetizes something that we say all the time on this podcast about violence, which is basically that it's like a really annoying conversation to have, but if you're going to have it, you can have it in a way that also sees supposedly nonviolent actions as profoundly violent with respect to certain social orders, certain ways of life. And again, I think it just kind of shows the power of poetry to express that in a way that if you wrote an essay about it, people might feel a little guarded or ready to find the chink in the armor or something like that. But here she's encouraging you to feel playful with the language, which is exactly how you should feel, I think, with a word like violence, since it just gets deployed in so many bizarre ideological conversations that you kind of can't help but be a bit playful with it, even though it's immensely serious topic.
Yeah, what I really appreciate about this, I mean, a lot of things, but framing these people in King of Prussia as followers of some person from the 8th century BC, it really explicates how funny the situation is, and it explicates like how much like the religious rhetoric would weigh on that judgment and how much that would distract, I think, people from the conversation about violence. Like, if she would have mentioned right from the start, like, well, they're Christians and this was Jesus and all this kind of stuff, right? Like, that would that would already like set a bunch of people on edge. A lot of like red flags would go up for people reading this, but doing it this other way is funny because it makes it seem that much more like obscure and strange, and like, you know, you're just kind of caught off guard by like whatever this weird group of people are.
Right. Yeah, that's right. And it's just neat to kind of play with the violence and non-violence piece of it with that in mind too, right? That they're being guided to act in this way, this violent pacifist way, by living into some strange reality that just doesn't kind of match up. Faced with the title of the poem too, you know, when I was asked for the 502nd time what I thought about violence, I think the story that she tells is so interesting because it's, first of all, a response to a question she's been asked over and over, and it comes with a pretty clear sense of impatience. And I like that too. That's like, okay, you want to talk about violence? Let me tell you this story about a bunch of people who broke in to destroy some like innocent pieces of weaponry. It's like a really neat way of just kind of cutting the crap when it comes to questions about violence.
Yeah, that's right. It's pretty cool.
It's pretty cool. That's poetry. It makes you think, and it's pretty cool.
That's literally all we are capable of saying about it.
Well, I think that's probably a great segue to move into the thing that we always do at the end of these arcs, which is namely to do our final sort of VeggieTales moment, what we have learned by doing all of these episodes on theme.
In case that doesn't make any sense to you, at the end of every VeggieTales episode, they would do a wrap up and sing a song and tell you what you learned. So that's what we're doing. All right, so Dean, what did you learn? Are you the tomato or the cucumber, would you say, in this relationship?
That's a really good question. I feel this is a question that we can't answer for ourselves, but can only be answered by the listeners.
I think that's true. Yeah, well, go ahead and call in and vote for which one of us is Larry Boy.
And which one of us is that stick in the mud tomato Bob?
Robert Tomato.
Robert Tomato. Robert Tomato and Lawrence the Cucumber.
That's
are really great.
That's what they're going to be called in the Adult Swim spin-off that they've hired us specifically to run.
I can't wait to make that asparagus character.
Meatwad, but he's a tomato.
What have I learned in my vegetable journey through poetry? I mean, I feel I definitely learned a lot about poetry as a medium in particular. And that was the most interesting thing as a person who is like theory-brained, which may be a defect in some ways. But I was just really interested in figuring out, you know, like what is Cardinal doing when he writes a poem in a certain way? What's exteriorismo about? What's he trying to accomplish and why? Which is kind of hard for me to get because I don't really know the constellation of figures or traditions that he's kind of playing with, but I think I have a better understanding now. I think those were the most interesting moments when we were kind of talking through things with Tegan and Dominic, as I was trying to reflect on that. And even looking at Joe Wallace's like bizarre methodology is like, you know, I want to know why people do that and not something else. So I feel I've got a little more clarity on all of that, and who knows, maybe one day I'll try to write a poem, and now I'll at least have some more things to think about instead of just putting together a bunch of weird words that I hope sound a little less weird, but not too less weird. They should still be a little bit weird.
Yeah, that's right.
What about you, Matt?
Okay. I don't know anything about poetry still. No, I'm sorry, that's wrong. We've done several podcast episodes about poetry. I know everything about poetry. And
you know, at least like 4.5 hours worth of information about poetry.
And it's 4.5 hours more than I knew before this, so that's pretty good. I don't know. I mean, on that point though, I think that at least to me, poetry seems astoundingly pedagogical. Like, it's a really good avenue for teaching people things. And I didn't realize that, I guess, my preconception was that poetry was about your inside feelings, and I think it is about that still in a really profound way. But more than that, it ends up being about like, how do you convince and convict someone about those inside feelings, or not your exterior feelings even, or some other topic, who knows? But like, how do you get a point across to somebody in only a handful of lines? And maybe that's all wrong. Maybe if you're a person that knows about poetry, you're listening to this like, this guy is stupid. And like, listen, I am. But I think there's something to it. I think there's something to it where poetry ends up, I don't know, it can say something to you that's deeply profound that will definitely take you a long time to like figure out. But it teaches you something that you didn't know before.
Yeah, I like that, because it's also, it might even be that poetry is sometimes pedagogical in spite of itself, right? That the whole death of the author thing, like a poet may not know what they're communicating to a reader, but a reader is still going to learn something by struggling through the text.
Yeah,
that's really
totally
neat.
I mean, even just like the ogre metaphor that's running out through so many of Zoela's poems, I think that is a really interesting pedagogical moment, right? Because it's telling you, a person who lives in the imperial core or whatever, about like how extremely complicated that is, and like, why do you do these things? Like, why do you think that you need a stronger military? Why are you like, all crazy about the troops and spending more money on the military budget, right? And like, she's trying to help us understand why we are that way through this like, mythological moment that tells us something about ourselves. And I think that's good.
Yeah, I feel too, coupled with that pedagogical piece, there's also, this might just be because we've been reading poems by lefty types, but there's a sort of activating moment in poetry that I don't really get from reading, Capital or something. Like reading about how coats get made and how much linen costs doesn't really make me want to like go out and get in the streets or something. But reading Ernesto Cardenal say that like seeing the FSLN letters on a mountainside is like a revelation from God makes me feel like, whoa. It makes me want to do something. And that is a pretty unique power of poetry. I mean, I've read some potent essays in my life, but there's something about reading a poem, especially like a poem that you can read that's just a few pages long even, and you get to the end of it and you're like, now I've got it. There's something about that just feels kind of energizing and activating.
Yeah, absolutely.
It reminds me of Julia Kristeva, who I mentioned briefly somewhere else on this podcast. She wrote a book called Revolution in Poetic Language, and she has this really bizarre and interesting argument in it where she says that poetry is kind of like the moment where language kind of breaks down, and it's like the excess of our energies or the excess of our drives that sort of can't quite be finally contained in language. And she ties that together with revolutionary politics, because revolution is also this moment of excess where the social order that currently exists just can't really contain the drives that it's trying to organize. And so those drives spill out into a revolutionary moment. And to tie language and politics together in that way, I think has always kind of made me interested in poetry, but not really capable of seeing how it pans out. And she has some specific kind of poems and poetry in mind, but I think it works with these too, right? There's this, like when you read a poem by like Tegan Steele Fisher about trying to work out, these different voices, the apostate voice, the ideological voice, etc. There is this kind of moment of like excess or plenitude in theology where you're like, oh yeah, regular Christian writing just doesn't really capture this feeling or something. But there's a lot of drives getting communicated in that kind of language that maybe gets you in touch with your own drives or your own kind of revolutionary moments that you didn't really think were possible. And I think that's a unique power of poetry that I want to think more about.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because you kind of just can, I don't know, toss away the rules for a minute and just let it all come out, or put it in a really particular way that you couldn't if you followed the rules of writing or whatever more explicitly.
Right.
Yeah, that sort of like that format of being short and like the absence of rules, I think makes for a really interesting moment.
Yeah, and I mean, some of the poems that we read by Tegan and Dominic are interesting to me because they function as these really like destructive machines with respect to certain forms of Christianity or certain forms of politics. And that's like a wild thing, you know. They really do something in the world that, again, like you can do with prose, but it's really hard. It's harder to do by reading, you know, a 50-page like essay
Yeah, definitely.
than reading a poem on a page.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, there's also like a lot more force behind them as well. I mean, I was just thinking about some of Dominic's poems, particularly, you know, like setting fire to business schools and throwing your boss in a furnace and stuff. There are things you can say in a poetic format that you can't in other spaces, and I think for the better.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and it's good that there's a medium where you can let those drives loose a little bit and just see where they go. So there you have it. Poetry is cool. It makes you think. And if you're a psychoanalyst, you can think about drives when you read them.
We should have read that Gustavo stuff. I don't know why we didn't do that.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I was just sick of reading theory books. And then I went on vacation, and now I can't think at all. So maybe one day.
Fair enough.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard over this whole arc, you should go support the poets that we read. Specifically Tegan and Dominic. You definitely ought to support them and find out where they're publishing. And Tegan has a book that you can buy. Dominic works with the Proteon magazine that you can read and support there as well. So we encourage you to do that. You can also support us on patreon.com/the Magnificast. We really value everybody's financial support. It's a huge help in making this podcast worth it. We do a lot of work for it, and we're really grateful for people being into it. The music, as always, is by Amoria Armstrong, and the outro is by the Illogical Spoon. See you next week.
No church, we'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late.